Exclusive funding for this edition of Around and About New Jersey has been made possible by Beneficial Management Corporation, which promotes education in New Jersey. The Revolutionary War was an important time in our nation's history. The United States was born when the people of the British colonies fought to gain independence from England.
Company, make ready!
It was also a fascinating time. Even today, people dress up like Revolutionary War soldiers. They try to imagine the life of a soldier in the Continental Army. So if you'd like to be a soldier in the War for Independence, hop in line, but don't forget your gunpowder as we go around and about New Jersey. Today on Around and About New Jersey, we're traveling to the northern section of the state to visit Morris County, home of Morristown National Historical Park. The park is a great place to learn about the Revolutionary War. Things that happened here over 200 years ago are still important to us today. Because Morristown served as a winter encampment twice during the war, the federal government made it a national park. Today, you'll learn all about Morristown, why the Continental Army came here, what the soldiers' living conditions were, and how the soldiers reacted to these conditions.
So we're in a special place. We're in a place that is a historically significant
You'll also
place.
meet the park rangers who talk to visitors about the soldiers' day-to-day life at Morristown. They also talk about why Morristown was chosen to be an encampment in the first place, and that requires learning about one very important person. When you think of the Revolutionary War, what one person comes to your mind immediately? George Washington was from Virginia, where he owned a large tobacco plantation. Like most Virginia planters, he owned slaves. He gained military experience fighting with the British against the French in a war over North American territory. When the War of Independence began, the Continental Congress appointed Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Why did Washington bring his army to Morristown? First of all, the British headquarters was located in New York. Washington chose Morristown because it was close enough to keep an eye on the British, but it was also protected from New York by both the Watchung Mountains and the Great Swamp. It was also close to iron mines and foundries in northern New Jersey that supplied the Army with cannons and cannonballs. There's another reason why Washington chose Morristown. That's Morristown down there, and beyond those mountains is New York. From a hill like this one, a soldier could look out for a British attack. In January 1777, after his victories at the battles of Trenton and Princeton, Washington brought his troops to camp for the winter at Morristown. He had them build a fort on the high hilltop overlooking the area. The fort was never attacked, and after many years, some people thought that General Washington had it built just to keep his soldiers busy. And that's how it got the peculiar name Fort Nonsense. Washington and his army returned to Morristown in December 1779. On this second winter encampment, Washington and his staff stayed at this house, the Ford Mansion. The mansion belonged to Theodosia Ford, the widow of a militia colonel named Jacob Ford. It was one of the largest houses in Morristown, and Mrs. Ford moved her family into a few rooms downstairs, so Washington could use her home as a winter headquarters. Washington held meetings with his staff in the parlor. Did you ever hear the phrase, "Washington slept here"? In this bedroom, he did. Living in such a nice house during wartime was reserved for only a few of the highest-ranking officers, like Washington and his staff. Some officers lived closer to the troops in modest farmhouses like this one owned by Henry Wick. Rooms were small but warm and dry and felt a little more like a home than a barracks. Some people say that Henry's daughter Tempe hid a horse inside this house to keep the Continental Army from taking it. Can you imagine anybody bringing a horse inside a house? Meanwhile, the soldiers lived in tiny log huts. Who were these soldiers? Many were farmers and workers who owned a little or no land. Some were African Americans. And many were substitutes paid to serve in the army for other people.
Take aim! Fire!
Huzzah! Huzzah means hooray in the 18th century. Hooray! Why
Ted
am I
Edgar
saying
is one of the
hooray?
park rangers at Morristown. When you visit, you learn about how soldiers spent time training for battle.
Now I'm going to walk towards them. And I'm going to be told to charge with bayonet. Huzzah! She has a good reaction. Why? Why are they doing that?
Because he's afraid.
Yeah, they want to run away. They're scared. They're frightened. That is why you go into winter quarters. We said you can't move around. You can't supply the troops. But also in winter quarters, you're learning how to be a good soldier. You're learning how to load and fire your weapon very quickly so that they can face me, the world's greatest soldier, the British Army, on a field and be able to win.
One of the first duties a soldier had to perform was to take an oath of allegiance, declaring loyalty to the Continental Army.
Of America.
To the United States of America.
And to serve them
And to serve them
honestly and faithfully
honestly and faithfully
against all their enemies
against all their enemies
or opposers
or opposers
whatsoever,
whatsoever,
and to observe
and to observe
and obey
and obey
the orders of the Continental Congress.
the orders of the Continental Congress. The soldiers soon had their loyalty put to the test. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was the worst of the century. Soldiers were sick. Food was scarce. And the Continental Congress failed to pay the troops. A soldier named Joseph Plum Martin described what happened.
The men could not stand it any longer. They were truly patriotic. They loved their country, and they had already suffered everything short of death in its cause. They saw no alternative but to starve to death or break up the army, give all up, and go home. They began to show their dissatisfaction by snapping at the officers and acting contrary to their orders. One man even broke from the ranks. yelling, "Who will parade with me?" And the whole regiment fell in and formed against the officers.
Eventually, the soldiers went to their huts and continued to complain. They had a difficult choice: to stay with the army despite hunger, cold, and no pay, or to refuse to obey their officers.
Now, a lot of soldiers really didn't know what to do. They thought, I could go home to my farm, and I could be fed, and I could be in my nice, cozy, warm bed, or I can be here where it's cold and there isn't any food, and I could fight for my country. Well, let's think about this. If you were one of those soldiers, what would you do? What would you do?
I would stay because I could get killed in one of the snowdrifts.
I would go so I could be warm and I wouldn't starve.
I'd go because it would be warmer instead of stay and be cold.
I would stay because I like my country and I don't want us to lose the war.
Eventually, the troops received more food and money, and when the winter ended, military action moved out of New Jersey. The Continental Army won the war. The United States won its independence from Great Britain, and George Washington emerged as a national hero. Morristown National Historical Park is important to America for many reasons. George Washington thought it was a good place for a winter camp for his troops. He even made his winter headquarters here. And the soldiers who stayed in small huts endured the harshest winter of the century. The soldiers almost gave up here, but they didn't, and maybe that's the most significant reason of all. At Morristown, our country was tested. The war against the British could have been lost here, but the Continental Army held together. There was no battle fought here, but there was a victory. Exclusive funding for this edition of Around and About New Jersey has been made possible by Beneficial Management Corporation, which promotes education in New Jersey.